At the time of the armistice, cars came into town. Petrol had been very short, so they would have been used the minimum rations. Sounding their horns at the harbour, the boats were blowing their hooters, and I always think around Fort Regent it said that the garrison, the men of the garrison, they were soldiers there, lined the ramparts and waved down at the people in the street celebrating. So lots of happy moments and celebration. And being Jersey, of course, there would be some alcohol involved, and there would have been a few drunks, I think.
Today is Armistice Day, marking the day, and indeed the hour, when the First World War ended at 11 a.m. in 1918. Many will be familiar with features of the 4-year war, the trenches, the bloody battles of the Somme and Ypres, and the considerable loss of life. But what was the war's impact in Jersey, and how did the island mark the end of hostilities 103 years ago? Ian Ronayne, a published local historian with a particular interest in the 1418 conflict, joins us to share his knowledge of Jersey and the Great War. Ian, could you just describe on this day, Armistice Day, how did the armistice in 1918, how was it greeted in Jersey?
Okay, well, so we're at the end of a very long, painful war, and then we're at the end of a very, very long, painful year. It's always interesting, I think, to reflect on the fact that, unlike the Second World War, it wasn't obvious that the First War was coming to an end. And, for the first half of 1918, the Allies were certainly on the back foot. The Germans were looking like they're going to win the war. So we went through a very difficult period. It was the toughest time in terms of the number of men dying. 1918 was the most violent year as far as death's concerned in Jersey's perspective. So lots of people had either suffered a loss or were still going to suffer a loss afterwards. Food was while not short, there was lots of questions. There had been lots of questions about whether food would reach the island, fuel. And the British government had been very forceful in terms of Jersey having to send more men, send potatoes, that's what we grew clearly, and send money. So it was a very difficult time. It was also, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, the Spanish flu had just hit Jersey and was waning at this point, but still very much dangerous, and people scared about this thing. So a very difficult time. And then out of the blue almost comes the news that the war is ending. And if you know the background to Armistice, it was an agreed date, time, hour when the war would end. It didn't just sort of peter out or one side throw their hands up and surrender. It was an agreed time. And that came quite late to Jersey. So most people, the Germans carried on fighting right to the end, and therefore the horrible war was going on right up to that point. News came to Jersey. I mean, there was indications in the newspapers that the war was coming towards an end. Austria had surrendered, the Turks had surrendered, the Ottoman Turks, but Germany hadn't, and they were the main enemy. So people were hopeful. There was clearly hope, and there was rumour. And the day before Armistice, they'd been waiting outside the Evening Post offices, which is where the news wires came in, and hopeful of news. It didn't come in that day. Most people went home disappointed. And it finally did arrive, and the announcement was made that as of 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, the war comes to an end. And so there wasn't time to prepare any great ceremonies or anything of that nature on that day. It was more spontaneous. And those people that were in Jersey, and remember a lot of people had left, thousands had gone to serve, women working in munitions industries, people had been dispersed through the war. Those that were here understandably made the most of it. And, from early morning, King Street began filling up with people, revellers, and at the time of the armistice, cars came into town. Petrol had been very short, so they would have been used the minimum rations. Sounding their horns at the harbour, the boats were blowing their hooters, and I always think around Fort Regent it said that the garrison, the men of the garrison, they were soldiers there, lined the ramparts and waved down at the people in the street celebrating. So lots of happy moments and celebration. And being Jersey, of course, there would be some alcohol involved, and there would have been a few drunks, I think.
Yeah, so perhaps alcohol played its part.
Perhaps, understandably, having that kind of release that came out.
And you've mentioned about the number of people who left the island to take part in the war effort. Just paint a picture on the scale of that.
Yeah.
Did most families have someone perhaps serving away? And also, please just talk about how these people drifted back.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it would have been a mixed picture. There was lots of tension here in the islands during the war between town and country, because the country families were able to apply for exemptions for their sons. Right up until 1918, it was largely dismissed after 1918, but a lot of men were kept back in the island to work the farms. That was our primary industry. Whereas from St Helier, most sons went because they were in occupations that were considered non-essential. So there was a bit of tension. Most families would have absolutely, if you had a boy or a father or of military age, they would have either gone already as a volunteer or a conscript. We conscripted from early 1917, or they would be under orders to go. So in 1918 they kind of removed all the exemptions that had been given out before and said, everybody is now going to go. So, and this was up to the age of 51 now. They increased it to 51-year-old. Now, I always think that 51 in our world is not old. Of course, I'd say that, wouldn't I? But in 51 back in 1918 would have been a good age. So, yeah, most families would have had somebody fighting at the war and or away serving, They maybe a daughter gone to work in the munitions industry. We sent hundreds to work in the munitions industry. Women were serving in the armed forces by then, and voluntary aid detachments. So there would have been lots of people scattered around various places. And so when the war ended, of course, mobilisation didn't happen immediately. That was one of the great bugbears of the soldiers, was that the war was over. They'd signed up for the duration of the war, but actually Britain still needed its garrisons. They were occupying Germany, and they also didn't want to let the soldiers flood back into the workplace. So it had to be done carefully. So men continued serving and were gradually released from early 1919 onwards, largely. And they came back throughout all 1919. They would have come back. No ceremony, no bands greeting them. They would have come on an ordinary boat. You didn't know they were coming unless you got a telegram to say we were arriving. So they would have just drifted back, and come back into the island in that way.
And tell me about the loss. Tell me about how many people died.
Well, it's still not completely clear, to be fair, because there are names still being uncovered to this day. If the research is done, there are, Jersey sent maybe 8,000 men, or Jerseymen that were in the colonies that went, or in the dominions that went. So 8,000 men, more than 1,500 dead, certainly, and probably more than that. So it's not an it is an exceptional number, of course. It's an awful number, but it doesn't stand us out from other communities necessarily. It's no larger, no less. But from an island of 50,000 people, it's a really high, extraordinary number. And of course, for each of those deaths, there would have been 2 or 3, badly physically wounded men, and of course, unbelievable amount of mentally scarred men. So, a significant loss. If you look at the census, Jersey's population goes down post-war. Now, that's not just due to the deaths, of course, but people who went to work in the munitions factory, young ladies who discovered a life. They had money in their pocket. They were wearing different clothes. They were living on their own. Many would have decided maybe to stay there. Men that went and served abroad stayed abroad. They didn't come back. They'd married people in Ireland, and they'd married people in the UK, and they'd met ladies in France, or So yeah, it was quite a disruptive period in terms of our demographics. It would have been taken quite a few years to sort itself out if you look at the census figures.
And tell me about the German influence in Jersey. There were prisoners of war here, is that right?
Yeah, there were. So there were two groups. It's interesting. There's two groups of Germans in Jersey. One were the Germans living here. So people that had decided to move to Jersey for economic reasons or what have you. A group of several hundred, and many of them were shipped off island throughout the war. Some at the beginning and some throughout as enemy aliens. They were considered a threat. Were sent and interned. Whether they came back or not, I don't know. I know some didn't come back. They weren't allowed to come back. There's some remarkable accounts in the archive of people that were forbidden to come back because they were considered, the enemy still even after the war. And those that remained had a very tough war. So they would have hopefully been re-ingratiating themselves back into our society. And then there was a group of Germans that were brought here as prisoners of war. They were brought in 1915. To a very large camp in St. Juan's Bay. The remnants of it is still there if you go and look carefully. And they were still there when the war ended. They were working in Jersey, and so they were working on farms. They were working at the docks, and they'd get the train in every day. There's great stories about them getting the train every day from St. Brelard's down to the docks, do their job at the docks. Obviously, we were short of manpower. And I think they were fairly trusted by then. They weren't necessarily under guard or anything, or under threat. But yeah, they remained here for another year. They went back in October 1919. So several thousand Germans were here, the islanders were used to them. There's lots of one of the things that keeps showing up as little trinkets and gifts and boxes. These things they painted stuff and created boxes. So they must have had a strange relationship, and they all left on a boat and singing lustily as they left the harbour to their fallen comrades. Some of them had died while they were here and were buried in St Brelard's churchyard, which is why we have the Germans buried there during the occupation.
And presumably, was there a British garrison in Jersey as well? So there were British troops as well as Jersey militia.
There were less. So what had happened was that there was a garrison here when the war broke out. They left to go and serve. They sent other troops in here to train from South Staffordshire Regiment. They were here until 1917. They left, and Jersey men that were unfit for active service, frontline service, in other words, were conscripted into what they called the Jersey Garrison Battalion, which replaced the Jersey Militia. So about 400 or 500 men stationed at Fort Regent and in the barracks around the island, and they guarded the island. They were supplemented as the war went on by men from Manchester and Yorkshire and men, again, who would have been considered unfit for frontline service. They were sent here. So they were Jersey troops, not British troops. There would have been a handful of British troops, but they would have been Jersey men and also other men. And there's a few of those still buried in Jersey. You come across them from time to time.
That's interesting. Now tell me about, just going back onto the impact of on the island, and particularly the losses that the island incurred. First of all, was there any financial support either from the States or the British government? How were people able to recover both emotionally and financially?
Yeah. Okay. So yes, there was. Obviously lots of breadwinners went away. So we fell back on the parish rates, the parish benefit system, if you like. So the parish constables would have given out funding to families that needed it. There was large amounts of fundraising went on, so lots of campaigns to raise money, partly for the troops, but also for local causes. Really interesting challenges that we had both British people here and French people, lots of French people, French nationals who had come to work on the farms, and there was some reluctance to hand them any local cash, and there's some very grim stories of if women with 5 children who had no money at all, and there were campaigns locally to raise money for them. So they was given a certain amount. Jersey didn't receive. So at the end of the war, Jersey didn't receive reparations from Britain. Jersey actually had to end up paying money. Britain was after Jersey for contribution to the war effort, and we ended up giving quite a lot of money under some pressure and duress. Not that we didn't feel it was a worthy cause, but being Jersey, we didn't necessarily want to hand over our cash. But we did, and so we contributed to the war effort. And then after the war, men would have individually had to apply for money to pay. There were pensions. Men that had been wounded or invalided, they received pensions, very token pensions. And there's some, again, I've seen some awful documents where somebody's got multiple wounds, and the pension, the person checking them accepts this one and this one, but not that one and not that one, and reduces their pension accordingly. You think how tough that must have been. They also went to the Royal British Legion. That was something that formed after the war. So ex-servicemen's organisations began forming towards the end of the war and then afterwards, and eventually amalgamated under the Royal British Legion. I think it's their 100th anniversary this year, actually. And they would have gone and asked for money. And again, there were some records. I saw the records many years ago. Very pitiful stories of men that I knew had won medals for bravery in France and Belgium. Going in and asking for 5 shillings or 2 shillings for their kids' shoes, and it must have been quite heartbreaking times.
And tell me about how the island marked the war. Am I right in saying that, for instance, the bodies that had been lost in France couldn't be returned to Jersey? Yeah,
that's right. So very early on in the war, there was a realisation that, not from a British perspective, that there was going to be a class issue here, that people with money, families with money, could afford to have their loved ones' remains repatriated and buried in the local vault, and those that didn't couldn't. And Britain went to war without any mechanism, any kind of war grave registration mechanism that came out through the war. Before that, the unfortunate victims of war would have been thrown into a common grave probably. Nobody really cared about the bodies. There was a realisation early on that this had to change. But one of the rules that came in, it was a chap called Fabian Ware who set up the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the first Imperial War Graves Commission, decided that nobody should be repatriated from the battlefield. So in other words, you remained where you fell. There should be no distinction in death about rank. So if you go and visit a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery today, you'll find uniform graves because he was very adamant about this, which I totally get. But equally, you can imagine the poor families that were isolated. Not only they'd lost a son, a father, a loved one, they couldn't visit them. So their graves were elsewhere. They weren't here. There were schemes after the war that allowed travel for families. There were some supported schemes, but I imagine lots of Jersey families didn't go. So there had to be something local. And the government thought about this, and being our states, spent some time arguing over it. What should we do? There was a great suggestion. Somebody said, always makes me smile, they should take down German George in the square, which is of course George II, that statue, who was not a revered character at that point. He was one of the enemy, and replace it with an honest Tommy, and that would be our point of remembrance. So they argued about what should be done, and John Pinnell, who was the constable in Helier, who was a real mover and shaker through the war, took it in his own hands and said, look, I'm going to sort this. And he put a wooden cenotaph up where the cenotaph is today in the parade. And cenotaph means empty tomb, of course. And its symbolism, we've lost it to an extent today, but the symbolism then would have been, it's the place you went and remembered your loved one. You couldn't go to the grave, so you went to the empty tomb, and they were all there effectively. So the cenotaph was that location for remembrance, where you went and, as any, if we go to visit a loved one's grave now, we go to visit them where they lie. That wasn't possible. So the cenotaph fulfilled that purpose. And eventually it became the granite permanent monument we see today.
Now, you've touched on this, moving the narrative slightly sidewards. Spanish flu, obviously that's something that's at the forefront of our minds, having just gone through or going through a pandemic. How was the island impacted by Spanish flu at the time?
Well, significantly and tragically, of course, like everywhere else. Spanish flu, we knew about Spanish flu. It's interesting when you look at the newspaper report. Spanish flu came twice, actually. It came in 2 waves. It came in August, July, and it was less severe that first time around. So they knew it was tracking around the world, and they knew it was in the UK, of course, and then they assumed it would come here. And there was lots of great adverts about pills to protect yourself against the flu, and local chemists posturing various remedies because it wasn't killing people in that first wave. It was bad, but didn't kill. And then it came again in October, early October. It arrived, and this time it killed, remorselessly. I think the first family were in Hugh Street or somewhere like that, and it was the mother, father, and the daughter. Young people died, and died very quickly. And it spread around St Helier very, very quickly in October. It was a very short time, a matter of weeks. But at first, it's very revealing to look at how they handled it and we handled it. They refused to shut the schools. They didn't shut the cinemas. They said, we'll get through this, not a problem. And then they realized actually how devastating it was. So there was a sudden rush to stop everything, stop people gathering. But it was already here, and it was very prevalent around particularly the poorer areas of St Helier. So going back to John Pinnell, who was instrumental in the cenotaph move, he did great things. If you go into the town hall today, not many people look at it, but if you go to the town hall today, on the dais where they meet at the end of the hall, there's a plaque recalling John Pinnell's efforts during the great pandemic of 1918. And he organised nurses or helpers to go to people's houses and clean them up, and so on. And then actually it spread from town to the countryside, and John Pinnell again organised relief. So about 300 people dead. And of course, they were still dying on Armistice Day. So yes. Although the flu was definitely in decline by then, Armistice Day there were still people dying, and there's some awful, tragic stories about families in early November going to bury their daughter who had died of the flu, and coming home to discover a telegram saying their son had been killed in France. So real double whammies across the piece. So you were suffering at home and you were suffering abroad, and because the war continued right to the very end, people died, right to the very end. So the flu was just a kick in the teeth, I think, really for societies that had gone through a terrible, terrible time.
And just to perhaps finish it off and to complete the circle, when did things start to to lift for Jersey, both in terms of the flu, but also in terms of the economy, in terms of the impact of the war on Jersey? When did we start to feel good about ourselves again?
Well, pretty soon afterwards, I think, within reason. So I think it is interesting. We talked really at the beginning of this about the celebrations that went on here on the day of Armistice, on the day the war ended. The day after, they held a much more formal, sombre event in the Royal Square, all the great and the good, and it was an act of commemoration. And I think there was a realization that this was not something to particularly celebrate. It wasn't like Liberation Day. There were the Liberation Day scenes that happened 20 odd years later, but the losses were so severe, and that would not go away. Part of the healing was the cenotaph and servicemen's organisations and this kind of thing. But the island itself, to give the absolute due to the politicians that were running it at the time, it carried on as a well-run, economically successful island. It was lots of struggles because of the loss of manpower, but the island grew more potatoes than ever before and shipped them abroad, partly because they were asked to and they found ways to do it. So the island's economy picked up pretty quickly afterwards. And actually, I think that because we won the war effectively, there was no real change in the island. So what I mean by that is that there was clamour at the time for better representation in the States. So there was jurats and unelected representatives. That was dismissed because we'd won the war. I guess it couldn't be dismissed after the Second World War. There was a strong push for women's rights, and it did come through, but very slowly. Again, because I think the status quo was let's keep things as they were. The first union in Jersey was formed in 1918. The first strike happened, I think, at the docks at that point. So there was the nascent start of change, but it wasn't really strongly pushed through in Jersey. That remained till after the Second World War. But the island got back up on its feet pretty quickly. Individually, the families clearly would have struggled and suffered with their personal losses, but we had a growing tourism industry before the war. It got better after the war. The potatoes continued in high demand. So I think the island could get over this fairly quick. And they used the commemorative ceremonies. They used the 11th, of course, the 11th of November as that focal point to remember the suffering and the loss and death, and then I guess you could get on with your lives for the rest of the days.
Thanks to Ian Ronayne for talking with me today, and thank you for listening to the Bailiwick Podcast. You can find the podcast on all the usual pod places, and don't forget to like and share. The music at the beginning and end of this podcast is I Shift My Weight by Luno. Tune in next week for more.